London entertainments. This is really my take on when I was shut down in lockdown. I daydreamed about a day out, an evening out. And so one of my favourite periods is Georgian history. And so I thought, what would the Georgians have done to entertain themselves? So we're going to take a virtual tour through a day and night around London. And one of the joys of taking a virtual tour is that we're not restricted by how far we can walk. So today we're going to be around Bloomsbury and Covent Garden, make our way to Clerkenwell, and then we're going to go all across the river, along the River Thames to the city, the old city of London. And let's see what we can find. Now we're going to kick off with this gentleman, Sir Hans Sloane, born in 1660, physician to the royal family from Queen Anne onwards. And in his younger days, he travelled to the West Indies with the Duke of Albemarle. And here he avidly collected everything from plant specimens, animal skeletons, other curiosities. And subsequently, on his return to London, continued to purchase these items. And so by his death in 1753, he'd amassed some 71,000 items. And he exhibited them here in his house, number 3, Bloomsbury Place, in London. You can see it's up for letting at the moment. It's marked by a blue plaque. And he was quite an innovative doctor. So not only did he have this amazing collection, but he advocated the use of quinine as a treatment for malaria. He promoted inoculation against smallpox. And my favourite, which was even in the news today, he supported and promoted the health-giving properties of drinking chocolate and chocolate in general, because he brought back cocoa beans from the West Indies. And in the newspaper today, it actually said that they've just published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology that eating chocolate, this report says that eating chocolate at least once a week cuts the risk of developing coronary artery disease by 8%. So I think he was a man before his time, and I kind of respect him. Now, you might wonder what we're doing with a buttered bun. Well, it all comes down to this gentleman, Mr. George Frederick Handel, famous Georgian composer, who was one of the many visitors to Sir Hans Sloane home. And it's said that on one occasion when he visited, he had the audacity to put a buttered bun down on top of some of Sir Hans Sloane's documents. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall to see, you know, the conversation that ensued. Now, following the death of Sloane, he'd moved to Chelsea in his later years, hence, you know, Sloane Square. But he left his collection to the state on the proviso that his daughters were paid £20,000. This happened, and then they searched around for a suitable property in which to exhibit his collection, and they chanced upon Montague House, a property that was close to where Sir Hans Sloane lived. Now, the collection continued to grow, and the joy is, as we know today, the British Museum, again, very close to where Sloane lived and where Montague House was, and hopefully soon to reopen again. So very much a museum of the world. But this wasn't the only collection you could go and see in the 18th century. We're going to make our way now to Leicester Fields, or as you might know it better today, Leicester Square. So a place of entertainment today. Now, on the left-hand side, about halfway down, Sir Joshua Reynolds was living in the 18th century. And on the right-hand side, it was one of the homes of the artist William Hogarth. But the property we're going to look at is Leicester House. Now, Leicester House looked a bit like this. Well, in fact, it looked like this, and was the home of Prince Frederick, the eldest son of George II, who would have become King of England had it not been for the fact that he was rather taken with the new sport of cricket. And it's said that he was hit by a cricket ball and subsequently died. Now, when he died, the house then became the home of Sir Ashton Lever. And he opened it up, a bit like Hans Sloane did with his home, opened it up to people to go and visit. And you could go and see a wonderful collection, something like 25,000 items, mainly natural history, and it was called the Holofusian or the Laverian. Now, you may ask, is it still there today? Well, no, it isn't. But in the 60s and 70s, it was a theatre and a cinema. And you could go today. I popped by about a week ago. It's all boarded up, but it's now a cinema and a casino. And indeed, you know, gambling was a pursuit of the Georgians as it is today with us. Now, as I said, we've walked around. We've gone from our starting point. We've been up to where the British Museum is. We've been down to Leicester Square, and we're now going to make our way eastward. We're going to make our way down and along the River Thames all the way to the city. And one of the things we're going to see is still there today. But when it was erected, it was pretty much, I suppose, it was the shard or the London Eye of its age. And we're talking about the monument, the work of Sir Christopher Wren and his scientific colleague, Robert Hooke, who arranged for this to be built to commemorate the Great Fire of London in 1666. You had to climb some 311 stairs to the top, and it's 202 feet high. And they say that if you were to lay it down, it would go down across to Pudding Lane, and it would point to the point where the Great Fire of London started. Now, this was a very popular place to visit in the 18th century, and the panoramas were wonderful. You could see the array of spires of the rebuilt churches, and also out to the countryside beyond. Obviously, London was much, much smaller, and you can go nowadays to go up the Shard. Now, I've got a picture here. This is taken about 10 years ago, in fact, when there was some restoration work on the monument, because at the top it's adorned with a kind of globe of flames to commemorate the fire. And this is in fact is my sister-in-law at the top of it, because she's a metal conservator. So she worked on the restoration, the last restoration of the monument, and she very kindly gave me one of the flames from the monument. It doesn't date back to the 17th century, not even the 18th century. I think this is a Victorian reproduction, but it's rather nice to have, to say I've got one of the flames from the monument. Now, if we continue eastward, we get to this building, which I know you'll all recognise as the Tower of London. And in the centre of it, the White Tower, this four-turreted tower, the work of William the Conqueror when he came after he'd come across to England in 1066, and now nearly 1,000 years old. It was a place where you could go and visit even in the 18th century. Maybe first of all, you might go and see the Royal Mint, because this is where golden guineas were crafted, where they were minted. But it was more likely you'd pay one of the keepers a shilling and you'd go and see the royal regalia, as you would today. You know, when I, certainly before COVID struck, when I used to take groups or families to the Tower of London, you know, the key thing they really wanted to see were the crown jewels. And I believe that we've even got the Black Prince ruby here in this illustration, which today, if you were to go, you'd see in the imperial state crown. But the thing that lots of people really wanted to go and see, really that isn't there anymore. And this was the menagerie, because kings and queens have been given animals by fellow monarchs from around the world since the time of Henry III in the 13th century. He was given a polar bear, an elephant, a leopard. And by the Georgian period, I got a lovely quote here. It was described that you could go and see the lions and other wild beasts which are kept in a cage on the right of the west entrance. The most remarkable wild beasts at present in the tower are a lion, 4 lionesses, 5 tigers, 3 leopards, a panther, 3 bears, 2 raccoons, a spotted hyena, and a wolf. And again, you just paid the keeper a shilling, and he would show these to you. Needless to say, yeoman warders, who were ex-military men, weren't the best qualified in animal husbandry, and it meant that by the early 19th century, in the final days, a monkey bit one of the visitors, and the Duke of Wellington, who at that point was the constable of the Tower, said the menagerie is closing down, and the animals were transferred to a newly formed zoological society of London in Regent's Park. Here you can see one of the zoo's oldest buildings, and uniquely still used for the same purpose for that which it was built by Decimus Burton in 1838. And I think with these rather tall doors, you might guess that it's a giraffe house. One of the joys of living in London is you can go now back to the zoo, and indeed you don't even have to pay to see the giraffes. I walked up there yesterday and you can see the giraffe house and the giraffes really easily through the railings, so they're a bit of a joy. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I'm ready for a coffee, so let's make our way across to Covent Garden, and let's go and have a coffee in one of the myriad of coffee houses. Here we have the first of a series of 4 etchings by William Hogarth of different times of the day. And we have this rather upright lady on her way, making her way early morning to the church. This is St. Paul's Church, which is still in Covent Garden Piazza today. And you might see in front of her, there's this rather bawdy, licentious group of people who are having a very good time by the looks of things. And they've been, if you can see just in the background here, to Tom King's Coffee House. Now, this was a notorious establishment in Covent Garden, open from the time that taverns shut until dawn, ostensibly a coffee house, but in reality really served as a meeting place between prostitutes and their customers. It was rather rowdy, and it's said that the poet Alexander Pope, the writer Henry Fielding, and even our friend William Hogarth would have frequented it. But this wasn't your only choice. You might go to Old Slaughter's Coffee House. This one was known, each of them had their own specialty, and this one was really known because it was patronised by players of games such as chess and whist and draughts. And again, this one was very popular with artists. So they would have all frequented this. Now, Hogarth had a close connection with coffee houses because as a young boy, his father had been in charge of St. John's Gate in Clerkenwell. Now, this was originally the headquarters of the Priory of St. John of Jerusalem, the Knights Hospitaller, so going back to the Crusades and the medieval ages. And this gateway was built in the 12th century, destroyed under the Peasants' Revolt in the 14th century, and then rebuilt. And William Hogarth's father, Richard, decided he would open a coffee house here. He thought it was a very good location on the edge of the city. It's where lots of clerks training to be lawyers could come. But he decided that he would make a special rule, and you could only come into the coffee house if you were willing to speak Latin. Needless to say, it wasn't hugely popular, and poor old Richard ended up in the debtor's prison and subsequently, died there. So rather sad. But the good news is that St. John's Gate in Clerkenwell is now a museum. It's a museum to the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and also St. John's Ambulance. Not reopened just yet, but hopefully we'll be doing so soon. I think we should make our way back towards West End. So we're going to make our way now across. We've been up here slightly north of this map, and then we're going to make our way across the river, and we're going to go down to one of the parks, because visiting the parks and being promenading in the parks was very popular in Georgian period. I have to say I've done my fair share of it over the last months. I think I've walked in all of the main London parks. Now this is on our first picture. shows St James's Park. And during the period of George II and his wife, Queen Caroline, it became hugely popular and was very much developed, further developed. And again, lovely quote, it said that in the summer, St James's Park was so filled with society that you cannot help touching your neighbour. So no social distancing with this group of people. But in addition to promenading, you might also come and see these characters, these pelicans. I took this picture in lockdown. I'm not quite sure what they're eating. They were eating these berries by the side of the lake. But from the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles II on the throne, he was given 2 pelicans by the Russian ambassador, and that has continued kind of ever after. Even today, at least 2 of our pelicans are the gift of the Russian ambassador. And in lockdown, I read rather a nice story that said that during the Cold War, the US ambassador to Britain decided that he too would donate some pelicans. He didn't want to be outdone by the Russians. Now, that was great, except that pelicans didn't get on. And it said that a diplomatic spat ensued until it was discovered that the US birds were of the wrong type. So they were replaced, and thankfully diplomatic calm was then restored. Now, we're now making our way towards the evening. I think we've done quite a lot during the day. You know, we've been to museums, we've been up the monument, we've been to the Tower of London, we've walked in the parks. Now, let's see what our evening entertainments can consist of. One of the most popular forms of entertainment was to visit London's pleasure gardens. And the first of these that I want to talk about is depicted in this illustration. And this was Ranelagh Gardens. So opened in 1742 and on the site of the Royal Hospital where the Chelsea pensioners can be found, and normally where each year we'd have the Chelsea Flower Show. So that's where we're positioned. And this attracted a quality and respectable crowd for food, music, entertainments, and there was promenade concerts. And because of, I suppose, English weather being what it is, there was a rotunda. You can see it here in the background, 150 feet across, with 52 dining boxes at ground level and a gallery above. It was very, very popular. You can see a little waterway as well. And the second of our gardens was the Marylebone Gardens. This opened a few years earlier, and this was slightly different because it had bowling greens, evenings, every evening, a display of fireworks and musical performances. It was advertised in 1738 as a place of entertainment where airs, overtures and concerts given by a band from the opera can be seen. And the great room was designed and put up for balls and suppers. And by the 1750s, the Marylebone Gardens were very well known for their excellent food. Succulent almond cakes, delicious plum and seed cakes, and other delicacies. There's rather a nice story, in fact, of George Frederick Handel, who lived not too far away, and his music used to be played there. And one evening he was walking with an elderly parson when the band struck up and a tune was played. And at the end of it, he said to the parson, you know, what did you think of that music? And the parson said, it wasn't really worth listening to. It was very poor stuff. To which Handel is supposed to have retorted, yes, I thought the same when I'd written it myself. Now, the gardens went on until the 1770s when the area of Marylebone had really grown, was very popular. And they became a victim of their own success because local residents then complained about the myriad of these firework displays and how noisy they were. So the firework displays were banned and subsequently the gardens were closed. But perhaps the most famous of all were the Vauxhall Gardens. So positioned or sited just south of where today we have Vauxhall bus station. So we're just south of the River Thames. And these were converted from simple gardens into wonderful pleasure gardens in the 1730s by Jonathan Tyers. He cultivated a large art collection, and he got people like Hogarth the painter, Rubiac, the sculptor, to make items for the gardens. You could dance. You probably arrived by river because it was so close to the River Thames. And well, it's said that the admission fee theoretically guaranteed that patrons wouldn't have to rub shoulders with the lower classes of the city. You were paying a shilling to come to these gardens, which when an apprentice or a servant only earned a few pounds a year, you know, it was a pretty major outlay. That said, Ranelagh Gardens was a little bit more, well, far more at market because it cost you 2 and 6 to go to the Ranelagh Gardens. Now, despite efforts to keep out the riffraff at Vauxhall Gardens, it had a slightly louche reputation. It had lots of wooded groves and shady alleyways, which were just perfect for discreet assignations, and well-dressed prostitutes were associated with the gardens, and London print shops started to sell these kind of illustrations with titles such as the Vauxhall Demi-Rep, beguiling ladies in rather expensive but revealing clothing. Now, if you were going out for an evening, obviously food was important. I said that Marylebone was renowned for its food. You might go and get some food from the sausage man or an oyster seller. Indeed, you could get food at Vauxhall, but its reputation for food wasn't that great. In fact, it was said that ham at Vauxhall was cut so thinly, it was said that one could read a newspaper through it. And even today, if anyone refers to, you know, food being a bit like Vauxhall ham, it normally implies it's of a very poor or parsimonious quality. Now, talking of food, if you were going to the theatre or the opera, food and drink played a big part in the evening's entertainment. You can see here, yes, they are at the theatre, but, you know, apart from the licentious behaviour, you know, you've got baskets of food being passed up, you've got people laughing and talking and maybe drinking amongst themselves. It was a major part of the evening's entertainment. And what you might be doing is coming to somewhere like Drury Lane. This was one of the only 2 patent theatres that was allowed to put on serious drama. And, you know, as I say, alcohol and food played a big part. You know, sometimes they pelted the actors with rotten fruit and veg. And you might be coming to see this gentleman. Again, this is a painting by William Hogarth. It's depicting David Garrick, who I suppose he was one of the very first celebrity actors of the time, and he's depicted here playing the part of Richard III. And he liked this painting so much that he commissioned Hogarth to provide him with copies of it, and he would sign them for his adoring fans. So we've got theatre, we've got a bit of opera. I think we should have we have some more fireworks here. So we've gone back to St James's Park for an evening of entertainment. This was the greatest celebration, really, of the whole of the 18th century, and was on the occasion, you might just see at the top, it says the general peace, on the account of the general peace signed at Aix-la-Chapelle. And it was held in Green Park in April 1749 for George II. And a huge palace was built, the Temple of Peace. It was basically marking the end of the War of Austrian succession. And it was 140 feet long, adorned with statues, paintings. It took some 4 months to make. And there was a rehearsal at Vauxhall Gardens about a week before. And on the night, when there's another picture here of this spectacle, there was a crowd of 12,000 people who'd all paid 2 and 6pence each. And the traffic jam over London Bridge, which was the only bridge across the River Thames at that time in central London, it said that you had a queue that took you 3 hours to get to St James's Park. And on the night, there were 40 trumpets, 20 French horns, kettle drums. George II had wanted it to be a military kind of pageant, really, and he'd asked Handel to write some music, but said that on no account should there be any fiddles, no violins. Handel subsequently got his own back because he added some orchestration with violins when it was later shown at the Foundling Hospital. But it didn't all go to plan because there were 160,000 fireworks that night under the control of an Italian maestro. But within an hour of it starting, the Wooden Palace caught alight, and the fireworks, well, I suppose they went off rather faster than people had expected. So we've been to the gardens, we've been to see the fireworks. I think we should try and be a little bit healthy as well as evening's entertainment. So we could go and take the waters. I suppose nowadays we think about going to Bath Spa, but London had a whole myriad of spas that you could visit. Here we have another of Hogarth's 4 Times of the Days etching. This is evening, and just on the left-hand side, the house there, it says Sadler's Wells. So this family have been to take the waters at Sadler's Wells. They're coming home. The husband's carrying a little girl. Why has he got horns on his head? Well, just behind his wife, there's a cow, or there's a bull. But some of you might know already that the sign of a cuckolded husband is having these horns behind their head. So one wonders who the father of this little girl is. Anyway, Sadler's Wells had opened in the late 17th century when Thomas Sadler, who owned the land, discovered a well in his grounds which he thought had healing properties. And by the end of the 18th century, it was laid out as gardens, concerts, prize fighters. Again, I found an advert from 1740 that said that if we were to go tonight, there would be rope dancing, tumbling, singing, several new grand dances, and several extraordinary performances by Monsieur Hendrik Kerman, the famous ladder dancer. Not quite sure what one of those is. And later on, we might see dancing dogs and a singing duck. Now, the waters around Clerkenwell were fortified with iron. And if we were to go a little bit further west, we'd get to King's Cross, where King's Cross Station is today. And near there, Bagney Wells. And this was a very upmarket, desirable place to visit. You can see scenes here, people taking the waters in very much high fashion. And the waters here were said to produce a kind of giddiness with an amazing flow of spirits and afterwards a propensity to sleep. And they claimed that the waters would cure violent disorders, breathing difficulties, weak and inflamed eyes, swellings, breast cancer, vomiting, loss of appetite, and gout. Maybe they'd even cure COVID-19, who knows? So they're looking very grand here. Not just water, there was tea and other stronger beverages as well. If taking the waters isn't as exciting or adventurous enough, then you might like to venture over to Soho Square. We're back in the West End of London, and it was here that in the 18th century, a lady called Teresa Cornelis, so here she is, she was rather a colourful entrepreneur, one-time opera singer. One of her lovers had been the great romantic Casanova. She was said to, one of her children was said to have been fathered by Casanova. And she had bought a house, Carlisle House, on the corner of Soho Square, and had amazing evening entertainments, extravagant masked balls with up to 800 people attending. And it said that people used to line up around the streets around from 9 p.m. to watch people arriving, and would still be there to watch them leaving at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And there would still be a huge volume of people leaving her doors at 6 o'clock in the morning. And to attract fresh crowds each season, she took to spending more and more money. And she may have been a good entertainer, but she wasn't a very good businesswoman. And she too ended in kind of poverty. partly because she had some new competition. So where her house was established, today if you were to go to Soho Square, and again the weather was so glorious in lockdown that I took lots of photographs when I was walking around. This is now St Patrick's Church in Soho Square, so this is where really the grounds of where she was. But the competition came from the form of something called the Pantheon. These people, I love this illustration, they're looking very highfalutin on their way to an evening's entertainment at the Pantheon, with its elegant rotunda in Italian style, masquerades, masked balls. You can see here people enjoying themselves. You can't go to the Pantheon for entertainment as such today, but you can go shopping there, because on the site of the Pantheon we now have a branch of Marks and Spencer's on Oxford Street, and you'll see at the top the building is still called the Pantheon. So they've sort of remembered its history and its heritage. Right, so before we end our evening's entertainment, we've been quite upmarket, we've been quite well behaved. So I thought we'd just touch on some less salubrious entertainments and pastimes from the Georgian period. We've made our way back, as you can see here, we've made our way from the city, we've gone back to Oxford Street, and you might go and see fist fighting, boxing. This was very, very popular. Not just men, but you could go and see women fist fighting. And indeed, it's said that, men and women would fight against each other on some occasions. Not only did we have people fighting, but I was going to go on to cockfighting, but before we do, I think this is probably a bit more of a disturbing entertainment. This is again a William Hogarth etching taken from the Rake's Progress, and Tom Rakewell is seen here depicted now as a lunatic. And some of you probably know that, Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam, which housed over 100 inmates, made a substantial income each year from people coming to visit the curables and the incurables. It had the air of a freak show, and people would go and visit the afflicted. So I find this one quite disturbing, and thankfully I think from about 1770 onwards, this public spectacle where people paid to go and see the patients did stop on a large scale. But as I said, not just people fighting, you could go and see cockfighting. I think the attraction here was the element of gambling that went on, and ultimately this led to the development of gentlemen's clubs such as White's and Boodle's, which many of them had their origins on cockfighting and the gambling, and then subsequently card games. And of course, we mustn't forget the drinking, as drink played a large part of culture. Now, if you think about nowadays, we've got in London over 8.5 million people living here. In the 18th century, we had just 500,000. But those 500,000 people, they were served by, and this is a lovely record that I found, it said that in 1737, there were 207 inns, 450 taverns, over 500 coffee houses, nearly 6,000 ale houses, and an estimated 1 in every 13 houses was licensed to sell drink. And I suppose this was at a time when clean water, and we touched on that when I did the Victorian period with Florence Nightingale a few weeks ago. Clean water wasn't readily available, so people often drank beer or small beer. And you can see here in Hogarth's etching of Beer Street, everybody looks very happy. You've got this gentleman with a kind of pot belly. Even the pawnbroker's gone out of business. The sign is broken, and in the distance you can see the spire of this church, and the church in question is St Martin in the Fields. So you can go nowadays, you can see the church. Everyone very happy. I'm just hoping that the concerts that St Martin in the Fields puts on may come back, maybe not this year, but maybe next year, if we can sort that with social distancing. Now, whilst beer was good, gin was bad. And Hogarth did this particular etching in 1751, really to try and encourage the introduction of a gin act to reduce the amount of gin drinking. And you can see here in complete contrast to Beer Street, you know, we've got this woman abandoning her baby. This was the time when just a few years earlier, the Foundling Hospital had been established for abandoned children. The pawnbroker is doing lots of business. If you look at the sign here, if you look down to the left, you know, one man's pawning his tools of the trade, his saw. This lady's got her cooking pots. You know, it's a terrible period. And in the distance here, we've got another church spire. And this church is, the area is St Giles in the Fields. And the church this time in question is St George's, Bloomsbury, built in the Georgian period, designed by Hawksmoor. And right on the top, and again, I went back on a sunnier day to take my own picture, you've got this statue. And the statue on the top is of George I. So a real Georgian. And I love the little ditty that says, they said, when Henry VIII left the Pope in the lurch, the Protestants made him the head of the church. But George's good subjects, the Bloomsbury people, instead of the church, made him head of the steeple. So here he is in all his glory. And I think we're about ready to finish. I think it's evening time. And I think if we were truly to behave ourselves, we might be going to Mr. Handel's church, St George's in Hanover Square, and you know, finish off our tour there. Perhaps going on Sunday morning to reflect on any misbehaviour that we've undertaken during our very busy day and evening. So there we are, whistle-stop tour of a day and night in London, in Georgian London, and hopefully giving you a taste for coming back and perhaps visiting some of these places once London and Britain's more back to normal. It's still pretty quiet in the centre. And just before I pass back to Emma, and indeed if anybody's got any questions or comments, I just thought I'd mention the upcoming tour to Scotland in conjunction with the Royal Society of Medicine. It's just over a week at the end of September. The idea is everybody travels up to Scotland by train, independently, and then we go from Edinburgh. We have some time in Edinburgh with the Royal College of Surgeons, visiting their museum. We've got a couple of really good lectures from people associated with the Royal College, and then we'll make our way by coach across, you know, seeing the Forth Bridge, seeing the Battle of Culloden. We'll hear from a military expert there. We go then to the Isle of Skye for a few days. Beautiful countryside, lots of open air, lots of fresh air. So it should be a really wonderful trip. And if people are thinking they don't want to go abroad, but maybe do want to get a break, then I hope you can join us. And I understand from Emma that I think more details about this will be emailed out in the next few days, or obviously just talk to Emma about it. I've no American tourists here. There's very few real tours taking place. So I'm doing quite a lot of virtual tours, but I am doing some small group walking tours. But if you're interested, you know, follow me on Instagram, or I think Emma's going to send out my email address afterwards. So it's livinglondontours@gmail.com. I'm doing some talks about King's Cross, about Victorian London. I'm doing one on Sherlock Holmes in conjunction with the Oldie in a few weeks. So a lot of things coming up, and you can book tickets on Eventbrite. But have a little look, and you might see in the bottom left here we've got We're Good to Go, which is the British Tourist Board's, UK Tourist Board's accreditation now for anybody and any institutions or organisations that are fully complying with COVID requirements. So, for example, if I'm leading tours, I have an app on my phone, and I have a face mask, a kind of transparent mask, so everyone can stand over a metre away and feel safe.